of Cicero. That's one of the reasons why you find names attributed in this piece by philosophical treatise. So for instance, you'll see a parentheses with the words Diophecus in it. And who wrote Diophecus? We just read it. Cicero. Then you'll also find references to Mark and Matthew in the Ebionitic texts. He's bringing Athens and Jerusalem together. We have to credit him for this. Who knows if Catholicism would have moderated at all, or even as soon as it did, if you didn't have a man like Thomas Aquinas, despite whatever faults he may have had, to bring all that together. You are reading one of the first things he read designed to make that happen. And it shouldn't surprise you that as you're reading this, you know what this looks a little bit like today, guys? Regulations. It looks like regulations from the Securities and Exchange Commission, or regulations from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or regulations from the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, because that's what this is. It is not like a Bible, broad and diffuse. It is more like Aquinas' Summa Theologica, point-by-point regulations. But we call these informal regulations. We call them informal because the state is not issuing them. They are being issued by the church. Secondarily, he is using a process that you and I know already. He's saying, here's the way that things are right now. And that is, and again, we've touched upon this, but it's worthwhile reviewing again now that I feel a bit better. So he says, we're going to look at things the way they are right now. We're going to call that the objection. So of course, in the dialectical world, what do you call that? The thesis. But then we're going to counterpose that the way good thinkers should. We're going to say, however, on the contrary, the church thinks you should do this. Ideally, the church thinks you should do this. So on the contrary is the same thing as antithesis. Same thing. We really believe you should do this. But Aquinas says, I don't care what the church says. Let me rephrase that. He does care. But he's actually saying the church is not exclusive of this. So we'll take that into consideration, and then I'm going to issue an answer, which we're essentially going to call our synthesis. He's going to say, I answer that. When he says, I answer that, that is the beginning of the tolerate and amend policy. Right there. So we can walk through this right now and then just get through the text. He says, when it comes to pricing, there is area for sin and transgression there. When the church says sin and transgression, you better change your ways. One of the reasons why you know you better change your ways, let's see if you remember this. Can a Catholic get to God without the church? Cannot. Cannot. Has to have the church in the middle there. So when we say you're going to amend, you better do it. Of course, you're all smart enough to know, because I prepared you for this. You know that Tony will tell you, well, it's an interesting idea, but didn't succeed. No, it didn't succeed. But you can't say the church didn't give it its old college try. You know, it tried to make it work. But then let's not forget, what was the church trying to do? It was trying to create a one supremacist world. No different than an Islamic jihadist world. Well, different in terms of how they behaved, but no different in its intention, trying to universalize one single concept and essentially coerce, force, inveigle all of us into that. Except in the case of the church, I would say that conquest was not always dependent on murder, but nonetheless, they engaged in an enormous amount of murder as well. So you don't want to blame only Islam for that. All right, so we have a pretty good sense now of what we're really talking about. Let's get into the work. On page 197, he begins, please, and I'm going to make this as brief as I possibly can, guys, because we've got a lot of work to do. I do think I handled things a bit too slowly on Tuesday. I'll make up a little bit today without taxing you too much. So on the first article on page 197, at line 18, he says, whether it's lawful to sell a thing for more than it's worth. So we're talking about pricing. Now when he says more than it's worth, what he's really talking about is a concept you already know. We've seen this calculus before. It's not too shocking to us. Even in 1270, when this is going to be produced, or 1265, you have revenue. Marketing creates the revenue. Those are your sales. And you have costs, right? So you have your cost of goods. That's the cost of making the product. It's a little bit more than that, but for today, we'll just accept that. We'll call it COGS, cost of goods. And then you have expenses, and that's virtually everything else, if it's not just the cost of goods for the product. And out of that, you're going to get what? You're going to get your net profit, precisely. And the issue here is, can you charge more for a product than it costs you? So what is your actual cost for the product? Your cost of goods and your expenses. Now, you would know something about the church, Catholic Church, and money. Some brave soul. Does the Catholic Church like the idea of money? And I don't mean for itself, I mean generally for the rest of the world. Do they like the idea of men and women pursuing money? No. Pinitas, let's hear it. You should know the Latin. I asked you to commit your memory to one thing. Anyone? For shame. You're lucky I'm in a contrite mood this morning. Good for you. Did you have to check your notes to do it? Good for you. Pinitas says, well, let's get it on the board. Pinitas est lorem radix. I've decided to put that on the final, because now I realize you didn't commit it to memory, so now I think you should. And we're covering it right now. So, Pinitas, love of money. Est is malorum, bad in a globalized sense. Radix, root. Love of money is the root of all evil. So if you are trying to pull that profit out of this, clearly you must be a really bad guy. So how could Aquinas avoid this? He's going to have to talk about this because the church believes that. And though he's quite a progressive thinker, I don't mean progressive politically, I mean just progressive in terms of his own intuitions and his own logic. He says, let's do it. So he does. At line 22, on page 197, he says, objection. The way things are today. It would seem that it's lawful to sell a thing for more than it's worth. So what's he saying essentially, guys? Are men and women in 1260, when he begins this project, are they selling their profits here and there? Yeah, I said, who are they? You know who they are. Crafts and guilds. They're making money on profits. He says, clearly, it must be okay. So if it's okay for the crafts and guilds to do it, and you guys are serfs, shouldn't it be okay for you to do it? Right. Doesn't the church ultimately say, we're going to allow that? They do. They ultimately say, we'll allow it. Only if there's a regulation to it. There has to be a regulation. And earlier when we were studying Tanya, I said you're going to see the original work. Men and women of real value in our society are men and women who don't spout a lot of crap the way liberals and conservatives both do, simply because they want to move you emotionally. I hope if you learn nothing from this class, it's the men and women who read the original sources that have had real experience with a certain subject, so they can speak about it authoritatively. I can't provide you with all the experience, but we're getting provided right now with the real original sources, so that's at least intellectually preparative. So what would the opposing view be? On page 197, at line 53, on the contrary, so if the church could have its way, ideally, it is written, and here's our first source, Matthew. So when he says Matthew, he's saying Jerusalem, not Athens, but Jerusalem. We're going to take a look at the biblical side first. All things whatsoever you would men that should do to you, do you also to them. But no man wishes to buy a thing for more than it's worth. Seems reasonable to me. Therefore no man should sell a thing to another man for more than it's worth. Therefore, ideally, the church would prefer that you not charge any profit. No profit margin. Only charge what? Your labor and your material costs. Which sounds very much like someone else we studied this semester who fathered the idea of a communist society. Karl Marx. He's pretty much on the same wavelength. Amazing. He was an atheist, and yet he has a lot in common with the Catholic Church, doesn't he? All right, so the question is, can we do this? Remember, this is a man now who has to universalize principles. If we're going to engage in tolerating the men, this isn't going to be just for a few Catholics. It's going to be for everybody. How do we come up with something that's going to work that doesn't offend the Pope, but at the same time doesn't say to the serfs, you may not rise from your position? How do we do it? Here's what he says. In line 60, I answer that. It is altogether sinful to have recourse to deceit in order to sell a thing for more than its just price. We'll come back to that in a moment. Because this is to deceive one's neighbor so as to injure him. Hence, Tully says, so now he's going back to a source, and look in the parentheses, guys, Diophicus. Who wrote that? And yet he says Tully wrote it. What have you guys wrote on the wall? Actually, it depends on whether I actually put it in the book. I didn't. Okay, my fault. His name was Cicero Tullius. That was his real name. So Cicero's nickname was Tully. Right? Tullius is his middle name. So when you see the word Tully, that's Cicero. So actually, he's getting this right. So he says, hence Tully, Cicero says, that contract should be entirely free from double dealing. The seller must not impose upon the bidder nor the buyer upon one that bids against him. In other way of putting it. Buyers and sellers should get together. They should get to yes. They've got to reach a deal that works well. But if you charge this, that is still going to be considered a sin. So all you're going to be able to do, this doesn't mean that the churches are going to give way and make other things easier for you. They will. Because remember, the goal is to take you from what is low, bring you up to what is high, and then send you out into the world of business so you can succeed at certain terms. We're not going to let you take the same profits that the guilds and the crafts take. No, we're not going to universalize that. We're going to do something good for you anyway. It's still coming. So how do you make your money? Know it now. I expect you know the term. You make it on just price. Technically speaking, that means you can only charge for your labor. However, we do find other writings later which are more clarifying and make the case fairly obvious, although I must confess that Aquinas doesn't do so well at that at this very moment, but later he gets it better, where you can charge for your expenses as well if you have them. So the way we're going to put just price, guys, is labor plus all your costs. So what's missing? Profits. No profit margin. That's your take, guys. That's what you get. Labor plus cost, your just price. Yes?
So the Karl Marx read Aquinas?
I have no idea. Great question.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Did Karl Marx read Aquinas? See, now you've challenged me. Now I'm going to have to check that out. It seems to me reasonable that he wouldn't have needed to, because he would have already felt cheated so much by the bourgeois class that it probably would have been necessary. And he was so opposed to religion by the time he was 18. He was born Jewish. His family converted because of the anti-Semitism that existed. And they converted to Lutheranism, and he hated Lutheranism. So I would say that by the time he was 18, he made his decision probably not to read someone like Aquinas, but I wouldn't go around saying that to a history professor, because I'm not sure it's true. All right. Let's move to the second article, please. The second article is on the subject of the product itself. So here's a guy who's walking through the 4 P's for us. Literally. He is literally introducing us. He just talked to us about price. Now he's talking to us about product. Cicero doesn't do that. Cicero brings up those subjects, but he never says to us, these are part of a strategic way of doing business in the world. Aquinas does. If you go to the American Marketing Association website, you'll see all that information, but you won't see anyone crediting Aquinas. I think they probably should, but they have not done that. All right, so what about products? On page 198, please, at line 75. It would seem that a sale is not rendered unjust and unlawful through a fault in the thing sold, and yet you can read the rest of the paragraph there. Well, this doesn't surprise me, and it shouldn't surprise you. He introduces this to the world around 1265 or 1270, something like that. We don't have an exact date. And how much do you think we had progressed in terms of creating 100% quality products in those days? I remember when I was a little kid, my grandfather used to say, they don't make them today like they used to in my day. My grandfather loved to say things like that, but boy was he wrong. We make far better products today than were made in my grandfather's day. Now, maybe in a few cases where things were handmade, maybe in a few cases that was true, but today we make products in scale that are just remarkable in terms of their quality. But in 1270, you shouldn't have anticipated that. So he says, well, that's probably norm, that's the way things are. All right, please, on same page, please, line 104, same page. He says, on the contrary. So now here's the church's ideal view, if the church could get what it wanted. Ambrose, there he is again, and look who he's quoting from, Diophagus, from Cicero one more time. It's manifestly a rule of justice that a good man should not depart from the truth, nor inflict an unjust injury on anyone, nor have any connection with fraud. You should not be producing faulty products. You can hurt people if you do that. All right, what are we going to do here? Let's set a regulation. I answer that on page 199, and I expect you guys to understand the nature of this. There are 3 rules he sets in place. These 3 rules, I love this, are still on the American Marketing Association website. Once again, they do not give Aquinas any credit for this. They state it differently, but it's really his rules. I answer that. A threefold fault may be found pretending that thing which is sold. Number 1, in respect of the thing's substance. So let's get that up there. I didn't do that. Let me do that right now. Let's get them all. It says substance, quantity, and quality. So I am going to recur. In fact, let me point them out to you. So at line 2, he begins with substance. At line 10, he goes to quantity. And then line 20, he goes to quality. Let's deal with each of those. With regard to substance, as the way he explains it is, you've got to be thoughtful about the substance you use. You can't be a liar about what you tell people. So we watched a video not too long ago where we were learning that Unilever's got this big plan to use different materials that don't degrade the environment or don't put excess pressure on populations. Remember that from the video we saw last week? Well, that didn't occur in Aquinas' day or St. Thomas' day, but that same consideration. If St. Thomas were alive today, he'd be saying, look, if you can make a product with a substance that's going to be less corrosive, that could possibly harm you, or less erosive, that could hurt ecology in some way, that's what you should use. That's what you should use. And more to the point, you should lie to people about what's in your product. Whatever is in your product, tell them the truth. That is substance. This may surprise you, but until 1991, we did not have to tell populations all the ingredients that went into a product. I could sell you a product that said diet ice cream. And who doesn't love ice cream? So we'd all rush off to buy it thinking that it's healthy for us and it's got low calories, but I don't really have to tell you everything about it. And so you think it's diet ice cream, when in fact it probably isn't. It wasn't until 1991, if I'm telling you, then I expect you to remember. It wasn't until 1991 that we introduced the Brand and Labeling Act. Well, guess what, guys? That's a regulation, and it came out of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Sort of like Aquinas saying, here's my regulations. Mine are called the Summa Theologica. Theirs are called the FDA regulations, and they've named theirs the Brand and Labeling Act. You guys following this? So you can see real close relationships between what Thomas Aquinas is doing as a priest and what our own FDA did in 1991.
So the Brand and Labeling Act, does that apply to, okay, I don't know if it's, I was an intern for a pet food company for a while. Pet food, that really expensive. And I worked with them on labeling, and they couldn't make, like, say there's a certain amount of chicken in a product, they couldn't make the chicken bigger than the other ingredients if the other ingredients were more. Does that apply to that, so you're not deceiving your consumer?
First of all, that's an excellent question. So there's two roles here. First, there's the company policy. Now, company policies are always based on a number of factors. One might be cost. So they don't want to put too much chicken in relative to cost. Another one might be health, but the side of health is probably as much a policy issue as it is a governmental issue. Believe it or not, I'm happy to say this, the government actually does have some input into what, and I'm sure you learned this, into what is going into that dog food so that you're not giving your dog food crap all the time, right? And hurting you. So it's going to be a combination of both. As to what you were saying, there'd be no way for me to know how much of that was company policy and how much of that was regulatory, but I guarantee you it was a combination of both. You would have had to. Now, there are companies that go way beyond government regulations, and they'll give your dogs much, much better stuff. Of course, what happens to your price? It goes way, way up. By the way, since you brought that up, one of the most wonderful things happening in America right now, if I can offer this as an aside, I'm assuming you all love dog and cats. If you don't love dog and cat, I just don't believe you're American. But there has been a shift in this country to much better dogs and cat foods. I bet in your own family you're even seeing some of that. People are finally realizing you keep giving your dog crap, your dog's going to die early. Your dog's going to get diseased. It's going to cost you more to take him to the vet all the time. So sometimes good things happen. We don't get all too